Welcome to Scrolling to Death. Today, I am joined by Parker Hymas, Director of Public Outreach at Fight the New Drug. Hi, Parker.
Hey, Nikki, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. It's good to see you again. We first met in person I feel like I've been saying this about almost every person I've interviewed lately, but we met in person at the Nicosi Summit, in August? Was that last month?
Yes. Seems like longer ago, but yeah.
Yeah. That event was so great. What did you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, being part of the Phase Alliance, being able to co-host it, it was great. Like, we were so excited to be there, and we're so excited for everyone that came. And there were great presentations and great speakers, and it was awesome. It was better than my wildest dream.
I agree. It was sort of like a family vibe, and just getting to meet a bunch of the survivors of sexual exploitation and different hard things was my big takeaway, and hearing their stories was really big for me. And I think for parents, our kids are at a very sensitive age, and they are getting exposed to some scary things on the devices that they're getting access to, whether in the home or at school. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I want to lead in with just asking, with your organization being called Fight the New Drug, what do you mean by the new drug?
Yeah, great question. So Fight the New Drug, we started in 2009, and the idea was to call it something to get people's attention. And when we say fight the new drug, we're like referring to pornography. We're trying to educate on the harms of pornography. We're non-religious, we're non-legislative. And our nonprofit, our goal is to allow individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision on the topic of pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects using only science, facts, and personal accounts. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's our goal, right? There's already research being done at major institutions. Nobody's talking about it, or people don't understand it, or don't have access to it. And we want to make that digestible and tangible for people to be able to learn about porn's impacts and make healthier decisions.
Yeah, well, most people who are parents nowadays, when we were introduced to pornography, it was pretty mild. It was usually like a magazine or something that it was tame compared to what kids are getting access to now. And our parents didn't really, most people now, I think, like that our parents didn't introduce this to us. We figured it out on our own, how to manage all of that and deal with it. And I think that these days there's just more harm in letting them figure it out. And so an issue is that kids are getting access to pornography at much younger ages. Do you have stats on when kids are first seeing pornography on average and like how they're seeing it?
Yeah. Maybe just one thing that I could say, you said something really good before you asked that question.
Sure.
That was that what we're talking about today when we're talking about what is pornography, we generally kind of refrain from defining pornography because every parent might have a different opinion about what is pornographic or whatever, and that's fine. But you did raise a good point that the pornography that you and I grew up with when we're talking about, or at least when I was younger, magazines and things like that, is not the same pornography that we're talking about today. And that's why it's become so problematic, right? We're talking about a completely different type of content. We're talking about videos online that are often violent, abusive, contain sex trafficking, right? Child sexual abuse material. And we'll kind of talk about that more, I'm sure, as the interview goes on. But just helping people to acknowledge that the kind of content we're talking about is not the same as when many parents were kids themselves. And then kind of to answer your question, when we're talking about, average age of exposure, the most recent research, we're seeing that the majority of kids are exposed to porn between the ages of 8 to 11. The majority of kids are exposed to porn by the time they're 11 to 13, many exposed as young as 8 to 11.
And are they seeing it? I don't know if we have stats around this, on their own devices? Is a friend showing it to them? Is it happening at school? Like, what are you hearing around that?
Yeah, there is one study that we reference when we're presenting. We do live presentations oftentimes to parent groups or communities. And one of the things that we reference in that presentation is we talk about how there's research to show that less than half of kids are first exposed because something popped up, according to that research, right? So definitely, a little less than half of kids, their first exposure to porn is something popped up on a device, right? A tablet, a phone, whatever it might be. But the majority of kids are exposed another way. What does that look like? And sometimes that's someone showing them something or something of that nature, right?
It reminds me of a fifth grader who my friend's son 2 weeks ago at school was playing a math app called Geometry Dash during class. And a nude image of a woman popped up and an ad for a virtual AI girlfriend. So there you go. It can happen at school. It can happen on a game or a math game that was provided by the school. So there's so many ways to get exposed. And can you talk a little bit more about the difference in today's pornography that kids can access, it being violent, there being sex trafficking included? Like, what do parents really need to know? Because I think I do hear a vibe from dads, especially, that are like, oh, our sons are going to get access to it at some point. It's okay. Like, why would you say it's not okay?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple things going on there, right? First, it's understanding, like you said, what's the difference between the pornography that kids are being exposed to today and when those parents were kids. Mm-hmm. And that is a problem. There's some disconnect there, some lack of understanding, right? We're not talking about images in a magazine. We're not talking about like a VHS tape. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we know from research that when people consume pornography, it becomes an escalating behavior, right? So they need more of it more frequently and more extreme forms of content. Mm-hmm. So where internet pornography has now been around for well over 20 years, the type of pornography that's readily available is often violent, abusive, degrading. And the problem is that's because there's a demand for more extreme content. So that content has only gotten more extreme over time. And that's many young people's first exposure to any form of sex. And that's not ideal, right? Like what we want parents to understand is that they should be having conversations with their kids and how to have those conversations, because the content has changed so much over time. Mm-hmm.
And we will talk about how to have those conversations. But when it comes to needing more extreme exposure over time, that is because of something to do with the brain, right? Can you explain a little bit more about how pornography access at young ages affects their brain over time?
Yeah. If It's a New Drug, we seek to educate all people on how porn can be harmful for everyone. But the one thing, if you're listening to this right now, the one thing we can all agree on is that there's an age where porn is not healthy for kids, right? Even if you disagree with the research that I would share or organization's stance, the one common ground we can all find is that porn is unhealthy for kids. They shouldn't be being exposed to it, at least at some age. Everyone would agree with that. I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's what we want to help people understand first. And then we want them to understand what is the research, right? So when we're talking about how porn affects individuals, the things that we see the most is that it can be habit forming, it becomes an escalating behavior, and it impacts the individual's mental health. And now, obviously, some of those things are even more problematic for kids because mental health struggles are even more dangerous for youth, obviously. And then also, the child's brain is still developing. So their decision-making abilities are obviously not fully developed. So this can become a habit, a compulsive behavior. It can even become an addiction. I'm not saying that everyone that's exposed to porn becomes addicted, but porn addiction is very real and affects many people. We talked about how it can be an escalating behavior, right? It leads to more extreme forms of content and sometimes illegal or unhealthy behaviors. And then it impacts mental health, right? So it's really interesting. When we look at self-reporting, we find that many people seek out porn when they feel lonely, stressed, sad, or bored. But the problem is the research shows that porn doesn't help with any of those feelings. In fact, it's linked to poor mental health, lower self-esteem, poorer body image, less fulfilling relationships, and more loneliness. Wow. So this isn't helping our young people at all. And I'm not sharing this information to scare you, right? I'm not here to scare anybody. I'm not here to shock anybody. That's not my goal. I'm not here to shame people who do consume porn or have been exposed to it. My goal is to say, hey, we need to kind of wake up as a society, as culture, and recognize the impact this is having, especially on young people today.
Yeah. I saw John Haidt speak last week at an event in DC. So his book is Anxious Generation. Everyone should be reading that. But he talked about addictive behaviors being introduced at young ages, and how if you are exposing a child to something addictive and their brain starts to rewire in that way, so say it's access to pornography, and then fast forward, they may experience increased risk of addiction to other things, whether that be gambling, alcohol, different things like that. So there's some early studies around that, and that is linked to also like internet addiction, social media addiction to the devices. So that scares me because, we want to set our kids up for success. And it scares me that whether it's just giving our kid a device with access to addictive games, like that could end up leading to some struggles they have later on in life too. You mentioned relationships. Can you talk more about how exposure to pornography at young ages can negatively affect their relationships as they grow older?
Yeah. So the research that we look at with relationships, what we see is that it impacts what people love, how much they love, and how they think about the people we love. So many researchers today consider pornography to be a supernormal stimulus. That means that over time, the brain can end up preferring pornography over spending time with a real life partner or seeking out real life partners. There's research to show that when, for example, one study by Perry in 2017, they looked at relationships over a period of about 6 years. They were looking to see what would determine if a relationship would be less happy in the future than they are today. And they found that porn was the second greatest indicator that a relationship would suffer over time, that people become less happy in their relationship when one partner was consuming pornography. The interesting thing about that is that everyone will be like, well, what was the greatest indicator? Was it money? Like there's all these things that we think are like what causes problems in a relationship. But it's interesting that the greatest indicator was actually if the couples started the relation or began the study unhappy in their relationship, then the greatest indicator they'd be unhappy by the end of the study was that they started the study unhappy. So it was really just that if people are unhappy, that doesn't tend to change unless they do something about it.
Okay.
And normally that would kind of be a control in a study. I don't know why they didn't control for that, but second only to that, porn was the greatest indicator that it would affect a relationship over time.
Interesting.
And then just objectification with kids especially, right? There's research showing that porn, over time, people who consume porn tend to objectify the people in their lives, including the people they love and care about. And with kids, that's especially problematic because it leads to problematic behaviors in young people, right? When they're taught to objectify at a really young age and to just see someone as an object to be used for sex or their own gratification and not to treat them with respect or dignity or like a human being with value, it leads to a lot of issues. And it's the issues that we're hearing about with kids, right? Sexting, huge issue, right? When someone under the age of 18 takes a photo or video of themselves without clothing and they send that to someone else. It's not only contributing to a culture of objectification among youth, but also legally that is most often considered the possession and distribution of child pornography, even if both partners or both parties are underage. And it has serious lifelong repercussions, right? And then we have to worry about things like sextortion. We have to worry about revenge porn or image-based sexual abuse, like all of those issues that young people should not have to be dealing with. But it's become normalized because of pornography.
Yeah. And so AI now plays into this in an interesting and scary way. And there's some new reports. What did I hear? Maybe at the event we were at, that there's millions of people that are in relationships with AI people, AI characters.
Yeah. I don't know the research around that, but I've definitely, I did meet someone recently after an event who was in that situation where they were having trouble connecting with people in real life, and they were essentially like in a relationship with AI. Yeah.
So the levels of this, it's so deep because, there's apps where you can engage with an AI girlfriend, for example, or an AI boyfriend that is bordering on some sexual nature, and probably full on is. I haven't looked into it deeply, but there's a lot we need to be aware of as parents that our kids can get access to. Before we talk about some advice for parents, I want to touch on social media, being that this is a social media related podcast. Is social media playing a role in our kids' exposure to pornography at this point?
Absolutely is the short answer. And then let me give you the long answer.
Yeah.
So there's a great story that anyone who's listening to this podcast, when it's over, I'd encourage you to go check out. Go to YouTube, look up Fight Through Drug, find our channel, and then go look at our friend Maddie's story. Okay. So Maddie is someone who I would say is like a great example of the classic exposure for a youth today. And that is that she was exposed to something on social media. It sparked natural curiosity. Kids are naturally curious about sex. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. That's totally normal, right? And then that led to that becoming a habit and a compulsive behavior, and then to the point where she felt like she was addicted to pornography. But that was from exposure on social media. And I think that parents just don't quite understand what they're really giving their kids access to when they give them a smartphone or give them social media or allow them to have access to social media, or when they don't, even if the kid's older and they're not checking in about smartphones or social media, right? Because at some point you want to prepare your kid for the real world, but we still have to have conversations. And that has really kind of created those problems. Social media has created a lot of these problems that we're talking about, right? Many young kids, their first exposure to pornography is on social media. Obviously, the things that we talked about, image-based sexual abuse, sexting, like these things are taking place on social media apps and platforms.
Yeah. And a couple things I'll note here is just because your kid is a child on social media doesn't mean they're not going to see it. In fact, they're probably more likely to see this type of content. I set up a test account on Snapchat as a 14-year-old girl, and I scrolled through their For You Spotlight feed for a few minutes. And I mean, I was served a video from inside of a strip club, like women dancing inside of a strip club. They think I'm a 14-year-old and have no access to any other information on me. There's report after report of young girls and boys on Instagram and Snapchat being asked for nude images, being offered money to send nude images. And those images end up being used on pornography sites. And so there's a huge link between the exposure to pornography and the social media access, and what gets promoted on social media is what's sticky. And sticky stuff with these kids can be violent, can be nude, can be things you don't want your kid to be accessing. One question I thought of is, and actually, I think I got it. We're going to go over some questions that I got from parents. But one thing that was mentioned and it came up for me again today is, how can you know if your child has accessed or been exposed to pornography, even if they haven't told you? Are there any signs that you would share?
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe even first, the best thing is just to ask them if they've been exposed to pornography.
So let's start there. How do you ask? How do you ask that question?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me give you a few different thoughts. So the first thing is that the sooner we can kind of normalize having healthy but sometimes difficult conversations with our kids, the easier that is as they get older. Now, if that means that you're a parent who's listening to this, your kid's 15 and you haven't talked about a lot of these things yet, that you're in trouble, no, not at all. That's what I'm saying. Like, there's definitely ways to do this. But the earlier we start these conversations and they evolve as the child grows and ages, just the better off generally, the easier it is. So for example, for a young kid, we don't have to rob them of their innocence by explaining pornography and spark curiosity and things that parents often worry about. But we can read something with them like good pictures, bad pictures, right? And we can help them understand that if they're on the internet or on a device and something pops up and they don't know what it is, that they come and talk to mom and dad, that mom and dad are always a safe place and that they have somewhere to go and someone to talk to. And that's not inappropriate in any way, right? You could talk with like a really little kid, like kids my son's age, about that, and it would be fine. And then as kids get older, we can have different conversations. Now, when it comes to how do we know if our kids seen pornography, the best thing you can do is ask them. And in a minute, we can talk about, well, what if I think they're just lying to me or whatever, and how do we go about that? But the initial thing is you got to ask. Like, you have to ask, and you might feel a little uncomfortable. So there's some great tips on our website. We have something called a conversation blueprint. You can go to ftnd.org and look up our conversation blueprint. And it's going to kind of prep you for these conversations. And I will say a lot of times people are hesitant to have conversations about, the birds and the bees and pornography and social media, simply because there's just kind of a lack of preparation on the parent's part. And the better prepared you are, the less awkward those conversations have to be. So that conversation blueprint can kind of help you plan ahead of time for that conversation. You want to get the kid talking as much as possible. You want to set aside a safe place and a time and place, make them feel valued and important, and kind of like prep them to ask about that, right? Now, if you feel like your kid is looking at pornography and they're not being honest with you or something, the best thing to do is to just kind of look for some key indicators and then continue to try to discuss it with them, even though they obviously don't want to talk about it. So what are some signs that someone might be struggling with pornography? Well, do they spend a lot of time alone on their devices? Do they try to spend a lot of time alone in their room? Have they withdrawn socially? Are they easily irritable in certain situations? Like, some of those things are being a teenager, but some of them are obviously like signs that someone might be consuming pornography.
Okay. And to touch on the younger kids, I've heard from several different sources that there's a lot in school of boys, especially, making like moaning and groaning noises. Have you heard about this?
Yeah.
So,
like trying to make like pornographic noises is what you're saying. Yeah,
right? but then the boy, say it's my son. My son has not done this, but say my son is like copying another boy. That doesn't mean my son has been exposed to that, but it's like getting to these young kids from some other child or maybe older child that thinks it's funny to make sexual noises. And I've literally heard this from multiple sources. So that's something that you may just want to be aware of. If you hear boys doing that, there may have been an exposure somewhere within the group, or maybe they're just copying an older friend.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't have to wait until a child is exposed to talk to them about pornography,
totally.
right?
Yeah.
And in the world that we're growing up in today, or that kids are growing up in, kids are growing up in the digital age in 2024. Unfortunately, it's no longer a matter of if kids will be exposed to porn. It's simply a matter of when. And so every family looks different and every child is different, and there are different ways to have these conversations. And we have great resources on our website about that. But I guess I'm just trying to say that there are opportunities to have these conversations, and we really need to try our best to do that, because statistically speaking, like 84% of 14 to 18-year-old males and 57% of 14 to 18-year-old females have viewed, consumed, or been exposed to porn. We talked earlier that the majority of kids are exposed by the time they're between 11 and 13. And 3 out of 4 parents, according to a study by the BBFC, think that their kids haven't seen porn, when in reality, the majority of the parents who think their kids haven't seen porn already have. So with that information in mind, again, not sharing that to scare anybody, but with that information in mind, it's likely our kids have been exposed to pornography. It's likely they will be exposed younger than we think. So how can I talk about these things now? What's the way to do that right now? Let's not wait to plant the tree, right? Let's plant the tree now, and in 20 years we can enjoy it. Like, let's do what we can to start these conversations immediately.
Yeah. And thank you for your recommendation of Good Pictures, Bad Pictures by Defend Young Minds. Also, I'll link to that in the episode notes. But I think societally, there's just been a shift from one generation before. It was like, most people look at porn. It's okay. It's not that bad. Whatever. It doesn't affect their relationships. It's not affecting their brain development. There wasn't like such a risk with it. And I just think that we've changed, like it's changed the style of it, the violence around it. It's no longer something that parents should just be like, oh, our kids are going to access it anyway. And that's okay. We need to say they're probably going to access it, and that we need to get ahead of it so that they know, what would you say, like to stay away from it? Like, what's the end goal? Is that as parents is us to say that's not healthy for your brain, and we would recommend that you don't engage with pornography. Like, what's the end goal?
Yeah, I mean, the end goal in our stance is that we don't want kids being exposed. We want to delay that exposure as long as possible.
Yeah.
And then we want them to be informed enough to choose for themselves not to consume pornography once they have been exposed, or whatever that might be, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Those are kind of the two main things, right? We want to delay that exposure as long as possible, and then we want them to make healthy and informed decisions and choose to avoid pornography, because it does impact themselves, their relationships, our society.
Yeah. And this piece about, I think parents are understanding more than ever in general society that kids, their underdeveloped brains makes it so hard for them to make decisions that are good for them at these younger ages. And I mean, that goes all the way through to the mid-20s, but helping to guide them through these exposures when they're younger, even through teen years, can just give them that extra time of brain development, so that when they do have more access, they can make a safer and smarter decision for themselves. So, okay, parents were asking, and then I'll get into actual questions, but I was wondering this too. Is there specific tools or software or services that you recommend to just block pornography from your child's devices or your devices in your home?
Yeah. And a lot of these you've probably already talked to your audience about. So I apologize for being a little bit repetitive.
No, it's okay.
But obviously Bark is like one of our favorites for monitoring.
Okay.
And I try to just quickly clarify, because maybe 10 or 15 years ago, people were talking about filtration. We try to encourage our audience to look for a monitoring resource over a filtration resource. So what do I mean by those two things? Filtering is just going to like block something and then you move on with life.
Okay.
Monitoring is going to like block something and then notify the parent, right? Or notify your partner or whatever, right?
Yeah, great.
Now, my only caveat with that I try to tell, especially when I'm speaking to parent audiences at live events, is to help them understand, like, monitoring typically actually goes really well with kids when they're told that there is a monitoring service in place. But if you just try to like install it in the middle of the night, and then you're just like, hey, so I was just wondering, did you Google this thing yesterday or whatever? And it's like, okay, that's not going to go as well because they're just like, wait, you were just like spying on me?
Yeah.
Obviously, nobody wants that, right? But we
Right.
just tell our kids that we're all doing this, we're all accountable, like we all have this software or whatever.
Yeah.
It typically goes pretty well. And that's a great resource because it's a lot more than just pornography, obviously, right? Bark's monitoring service is going to monitor for self-harm and bullying and predators and pornography and social media and all of these things, right?
Yes.
So we love them for that. They also have safe devices, right? They have a smartphone, which is great. And then there's other ones as well, like Gab. Gab's great. They have watches and phones. They have a watch. They kind of say, you know, for this age range, a phone for this age range, and then a phone for this age range, meaning the technology is kind of growing with the child. I think their watches are especially amazing what they've done with those, because there are people who kind of are in a position in life where their kids do need access to communication devices at a younger age than maybe you would prefer to give it to your kid, like a single parent, for example.
Yeah.
And the watch is a great resource for that. So there are both, I guess you could say, software-based solutions and device-based solutions, and you can decide as a family what's best for you. We have a great little landing page that kind of helps explain all of these at ftnd.org/parents.
Okay.
And you can just go through kind of all of the resources for parents, all the different devices, monitoring, break them down, help you find what's the best fit for your family.
Okay. And Bark is releasing a watch next month in October, which is exciting. And I just like the watch option because I feel like you can really delay that phone for a long time if they have the watch, you know. And the watch, you can know that it's talk or text only, where I know that those phones with Bark and Gab are so locked down, like they can't get around it necessarily, but most parents are still giving their kids an iPhone, and we have to have to avoid that as much as possible because iPhones
we
are
talked about that night at the C Summit. It's like, you know, the majority of parents are unfortunately still submitting to the peer pressure or the peer pressure their kids are experiencing and giving their kids like a phone that's meant for adults.
Right.
But if we can at least try to get like monitoring software or these watches and for young kids that really don't need a full phone yet, right? Then there's some great options there.
And when giving your child any device, it has to be well thought through, well researched. And and I love Bark. And I think that a watch is a great first option, but only when it's like you absolutely need to give that kid a device and not before. Not just as like, oh, it'll make me feel a little bit more comfortable. Like, that's not the time.
Yeah, I totally understand that.
Yeah. So I have a couple questions that I got from parents. Candace asks, how do we stay on top of it when it regards to our kids' access to pornography? I know they'll see it, but I want to be informed.
Well, I just want to congratulate her because she already overcame what for some parents is the biggest hurdle, is acknowledging that in the digital age, it's extremely likely your kids will be exposed, right? She's already there. She already understands that it's extremely likely, no matter what she does, that her kids will be exposed at some point to pornography. So that's the first step. But the other step is, how do we stay on top of this? How do we have these conversations? What do I do, right? So we have a podcast called Consider Before Consuming, and we had a guest on there a while back. Her name's Jill Robertson. She's a sex therapist in New Zealand. And we also have a blog with her on our website, and it really kind of breaks down, how do we have these conversations? How are we checking in, right? So there's kind of two parts to that question. Like, how are we staying on top of this? I would say what we talked about a minute ago, like filters, monitoring, safe devices is and having conversations is kind of the first line of defense. And then when kids are exposed, this content from Joe Robertson's really helpful for parents when we're talking about disclosure, right? So like, how do we know what the kid has seen, how long they've been exposed to it for, how were they exposed, who showed it to them, did they seek it out themselves, considering things that your child already struggles with, like, have they self-harmed in the past? Do they struggle with anxiety or depression? Do they have trouble making friends? And she kind of goes through all of that to give us a picture of like, what should disclosure look like, and how do we follow up these conversations with our kids when they have been exposed or have struggled with pornography?
Yeah, because you hope that when you ask that question, they say no, but what if they say yes? Like, how do you, what do you do next? So thank you for that resource.
Take a deep breath. That's
don't freak out.
Yes.
So this one says, awareness. Well, this is just a comment. Awareness has to be the first step. Parents aren't aware of how much bad is available. So I guess that touches on the awareness.
He knows all about that.
Yeah, I know.
So do I. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great comment. Yeah. I mean, that's the first step, is we're trying to get awareness to parents. So if you're listening to this podcast right now, you're a part of the solution. Great job. We're so glad. We're so proud of you. You're doing great. Keep moving forward. I know it's so difficult.
Yeah.
But you know what else you could do that would be great other than talking with your own kids? Send this podcast to another parent who's struggling or who you think this could be helpful information, right? Like, hey, I just listened to this the other day. I have no idea what your thoughts are about pornography or whatever, but I think generally most people agree that it's at least unhealthy for kids.
Right.
I thought I'd share this with you, right? Like, that doesn't have to be weird.
No.
And then we can help the parents that are unaware.
Right. And even like a lot of my episodes, I'm like, why can't a teenager listen to this? Especially if the teenager's already on social media, they should know. I know some of the stories where a child has died, like, but if you've watched it and you think that it's something your kid can handle, they should know how things go down so that they can avoid it themselves and know how bad it can get. And it's scary, but I think that's a tactic that works for some parents. I did repost. Have you heard of Mafe Art Studio? So Miguel, I'll have to send it to you if you haven't.
I haven't. Yeah, send that to me.
So he's an amazing artist out of London, and he does these beautiful. Oh, he did this behind me. So it's like it's like kids with devices and kind of showing how they're cut off from the world around them when they're on a device. And he posted something today saying change begins with awareness, and I reposted it actually. So that was a relevant question about awareness. All right, next is how do we get schools to have better restrictions on school devices? I can weigh in on this. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, do you want to weigh in since
Sure.
I saw your recent experience?
Yeah, so don't trust your school. Don't assume that those devices are safe. So I have put together 7 recommended questions you can send to your school principal, and then it'll get sent on to your district. But to ask about security of the school tech. And start there. And then if you're unhappy or unsatisfied with the responses, you can consider opting out. That's within our right. But I think when it comes to restrictions, like ask those questions, we should know what safeguards are on those devices. And then make sure you check your child's device. So go to school. Don't be like parents are afraid to be like, I don't want to ask the teacher if I can come in and check their device and just stop by after school. Like your kid's on that device. You can definitely check it and just go on Safari internet or go on the internet browser, type in some things, go to YouTube, scroll for a little bit, and you will be surprised what you find. So
for sure. Our friends at Bark.
Yeah. Oh,
did you know?
And did you know?
Service for schools, and it's
free. Bark for Schools is free for schools, and I recommended that to my school, and they did not take them up on it. And but there are thousands of school districts in the United States that are using Bark.
Yeah.
But Bark will send alerts to the school and to you, the parent, if your child has been exposed to something on their school issued device. So recommend Bark. Also submit the questions to your school and don't be afraid to speak up for your kid.
Yeah. Yeah. Bring it up because you know what your principal is going to say when you tell them there's this massive company that has this great software and it's free for schools. They're going to be like, wait, what? Because if
you would think, Parker, Bark, no.
Yeah. Not in every scenario, but I think some of the time they're definitely going to be like excited that there's something free that's going to help solve some of the problems the schools are dealing with and that take up so much of admin's times. But obviously in your case, unfortunately, it didn't work out.
I think there's a general vibe from what I'm hearing from district tech departments that we got it. We don't need your suggestions. It's sort of like a us versus them kind of feel. And we're doing our job. Don't challenge us. Everything's safe. We're good. When we just need to come. I know it's frustrating and something that I'm working on changing societally. But okay. The parental security locks, apps, and systems, do they actually work? So they must be referencing things like Bark?
They might be talking about like the built-in features in like an Apple iPhone, for example, the parental controls. Yeah. If you are in a scenario where you can't afford something like Bark or it's not in the budget, there are definitely built-in safeguards on phones. They are not perfect. And they are more complicated. They are going to take a good wealth of knowledge from the person trying to set them up to really get it set up correctly for your family's needs. So yeah, those are things to be aware of. Like if Bark or something like that's out of the budget, definitely at least be setting like the basic parental controls that come on many devices today. But know that if you're not super tech savvy, it's going to be, you're going to have to do some research. You're going to have to spend some time on YouTube. You're going to have to read some blogs and you're going to have to figure out how to set that up. And then you're going to have to like manually check the device and talk with your kids and those kinds of things. But that is an option for sure.
Yeah. That's not my thing. If I try to set up something
I don't have time.
technical, I get immediately frustrated. So it's not my thing. But the next question is actually best Wi-Fi and internet monitors, the best way to protect homes. Now, Bark has the Bark Home product to put on the router level, but your internet service that you already pay for, so we use like AT&T internet service provider, also has some parental controls that you can employ. So those are already included with your service.
And those are two things I always differentiate as well. We kind of talked about like filters versus monitoring before.
Yeah.
And we can talk about like protecting the Wi-Fi or the device. I always try to get parents to opt to protect like devices because the problem with plugging something into the Wi-Fi router to like kind of safeguard the home is when that kid takes that laptop, that iPad, that iPhone, anywhere else, none of those are in place. None of those safety guards or safety rails are in place anymore. And that can be as simple for the kid as just like swiping down and turning off Wi-Fi, and they can be in the home and it's not protecting their device anymore because now they're on their mobile network. So device monitors are great, especially as kids get older and have phones and things.
Amazing. Okay. All right. Last question. So how do we know, we've already covered this, but any other thoughts? How do we know if they've seen it outside of the home, like on a friend's device or at school? So
you got to just ask them,
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just shaking a magic 8-ball, hoping to try to like look for some sign that they're consuming pornography. And then we've talked about some of the signs, and those are great. But really, it comes down to like having those conversations. And what do those conversations look like? Again, like look at our conversation blueprint, check out our resources with Joe Robertson. Like those are great ways to kind of prep for these conversations and to try to figure out how to get your kids to be as open and honest with you as possible. And if you're a parent who has struggled with pornography yourself and overcome that struggle, or you still struggle with pornography, sometimes you may feel like you aren't in a position to be having these conversations with your kids. And I want to tell you, you're actually the best person to have these conversations with your kids because you yourself have experienced the impacts that it had on your life. And you're more qualified than anybody to help explain to your children why this content is harmful. So in addition to teaching your kids, about your values and things, share with them the science and research, have these conversations. They will open up over time. And one of the best things you can do, we have a free documentary. It's called Brain Heart World. You can screen it ahead of time as a parent if you want. It's appropriate for kids ages 11 and older. But you can sit down and watch that with your kids, and then that will open up conversations. I promise you. Like, they're not going to sit down and watch that and then not have anything to say after. 99% of the time, it'll open up conversations.
Okay. Well, there's going to be a lot of resources in the episode notes for parents. No, that's good. Because there's so many different ways to approach this that parents just aren't aware of, and we're scared to have this conversation. So we need guidance and support and education. So anything else that we didn't cover on this topic that you think is important for parents to walk away with?
So kind of the only other thing I would say is, Fight the New Drug, we say a lot of the research shows how porn impacts individuals, relationships, and society, or our world as a whole. We talked about individuals, we talked about relationships, right? We talked about the brain, we talked about relationships and connections with people around us, but we didn't really talk about society and our world. And I think it's important for parents to understand that this does impact society. It's connections to other things. At Fight the New Drug, for example, we say that porn and sex trafficking are inseparably connected. And the reason we say that is when you look at the legal definition of sex trafficking, it's a commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or where someone under the age of 18 is involved. So that was a lot, but what am I trying to say here? Well, a commercial sex act means money or something of value is exchanged for sex. So if there's money or something of value exchanged for sex, and there's force or fraud or coercion or a minor involved, that becomes sex trafficking. So one of the biggest problems with pornography is that people say, well, this doesn't hurt anybody else, which is not true. We've talked about how it affects the individual. It affects their relationships. You're a person, you have value, your children have value, right? But they don't see the bigger picture of how this is really impacting society. And that's that much of the content that is available on free tube sites is full of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we look at the definition of sex trafficking, it kind of becomes more clear, right? What we often see in movies is the force, right? We see someone being like kidnapped and held against their will. And while those things do happen, they're not necessarily the most common forms of sex trafficking, especially with pornography, but the fraud, the coercion, right? What does that look like? Well, let me just share two examples that we frequently share from recent media.
Mhm.
And one example, a young woman's partner took explicit photos and videos of her without her knowledge, and he posted those online in order to make money. And when he realized he could profit from doing this, he threatened her with violence if she didn't produce more content. He was charged with sex trafficking. And another example, a popular, well-known, mainstream, and I would even say kind of like highly regarded in the industry porn production company, was found to have been intentionally seeking out predominantly young women who weren't super experienced in life, who had smaller social media followings, flying them to California to participate in fitness photo shoots, right? So the women thought that they were going to arrive on set, or many of the women, I should say, thought they were going to be filmed like wearing yoga equipment or yoga clothing, using workout equipment, those kinds of things. Instead, they were picked up at the airport, taken immediately to a place to film. They were held there, some of them for up to, I think, 3 days, and they were drugged, raped, held against their will, not allowed to leave. And, if you film someone being raped for that long, right, hours and hours and hours on end, it's pretty simple to find a way to edit a few minutes of that content to make it look consensual. And so no one believed these survivors, right? This is the Girls Do Porn case that was brought about. The executives of the company, when this all came to light, they were on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. They were found in New Zealand in hiding. And that's just one example, right? And among all of this, we see on these popular porn sites, we see child sexual abuse material, right? Or more commonly called child pornography, although that's not like the most appropriate term.
Yeah.
We see image-based sexual abuse, which is what we talked about earlier, where someone may or may not have shared images willingly at some point in time, and then later those are used for other purposes, or sometimes in pop culture, it's called like revenge porn. All of this kind of content is what's available online, and this does harm real people. The very fact that there's a demand for pornography means that this content is being made and that people are being exploited, and often that includes sexual exploitation or sometimes sex trafficking in the production of that content. So help your kids to understand these impacts, right? If we want our kids to make healthy choices, we have to inform them. So when you're having conversations with your kids, I guess that's all I was trying to say here at the end is help them understand the research. In addition to sharing your family's values or beliefs or whatever, right? Share the science and the research showing the harms of pornography with them.
Yeah.
It will only strengthen their understanding of why it's unhealthy.
Yeah. And thank you for talking about the sex trafficking piece and how that can look these days. I think for me, really thinking about how easy it could be for our kids to get trafficked, for parents to think that our kids are not getting exposed to the even scarier side of this whole world is naive at this point, because it is so integrated into our kids' lives and access through their devices. So that's why, again, these conversations are so important. The monitoring tools, the devices, the safer devices. I appreciate you guys putting so much effort into actionable resources that parents can use to protect our children and prepare them for this scary world. But I hope that parents can walk away with a little hope that there's guides and resources for them. So
yeah, absolutely.
Parker,
and if you're overwhelmed by all the resources we mentioned, the easiest thing to remember is just go to ftnd.org/parents.
Okay. Perfect.
And all the things I talked about today will kind of be in one place there. So FTND, fightthenewdrug.org/parents. And that'll take you right there. And yeah, thank you for having us, Nikki. What you're doing is incredible. I applaud you so much for, just waking up one day and changing everything and going out there and trying to help raise awareness. I think it's incredible. So
thank you, Parker. I appreciate you. And I hope we can catch up in person soon.
For sure.
Okay.